Is it Trump time again, or will Biden boot him out? It's the battle of the grumpy old men and may be the most consequential election of our lifetime. Welcome to Q&A. Hi there, I'm here with Peter Dixon, who's got our first question tonight. The studio is full of American voters and Australians mesmerised by this crazy election. Answering your questions tonight, Kim Hoggard, who served 2 Republican presidents in the White House. Foreign editor at The Australian, Greg Sheridan. Damien from the New York Times. A security expert Trump might call a part of the deep state, Lydia Khalil. And political sociologist who doesn't like labels, Salvatore Babones. Please make all of them feel welcome. So, Peter, get us started. What's your question?
Well, while I'm not a Trump supporter, I do believe Trump will win. Not because I like him or even want him to win, but because I sense a groundswell of silent majority support for him. If my prediction is correct and he gets in for another term, what do you think the reaction will be from Democrat voters?
Greg Sheridan.
Well, Hamish, I think that's the scenario which is most likely to cause terrible civil unrest in the United States. I've got a lot of faith in the United States, the great American friendliness, the essential decency of the place. But if Biden were to win the popular vote by, say, 5% and Trump squeaked away through the Electoral College to get a bare majority in the Electoral College, I don't think that's going to happen, but it's very possible. I think you would see massive street demonstrations. I think people would be extremely angry at the Electoral College system. They would feel that they'd been robbed and so forth. And you might get real civil discord on the streets. Trump would be unbearable in his bombast and self-justification, although I think actually he'd probably temper down and be a bit more moderate in the second term than the first.
And why do you think that's the most likely scenario in which there'd be chaos and perhaps violence, more so than a victory the other way around?
Because Trump doesn't command mass support which he can mobilise into the streets. There are some very violent, horrible, ugly people who are Trump supporters, but they're not really a mass movement. Now, if Trump loses, if Biden is ahead by 20,000 votes on the night in Michigan, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, then it's all over, Red Rover, and no court is going to steal the election for Trump. I mean, at the very most, Trump may be able to get some ballots tossed out or something like that. I think you only get conflict if you're on an absolute knife edge with a Trump loss, and then I think it would be legal conflict. But there's no indication to me that the military, the judiciary, or anybody else would do anything unconstitutional to keep Trump in Pennsylvania Avenue.
Lydia Khalil, do you see it that way? That's the most likely scenario for chaos, violence on the streets?
Well, I want to be very careful about how I talk about the prospect of violence, because I think in a lot of ways it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If one side believes that the other side is going to resort to violence if they don't get their way, then they will be more the ready to use violence themselves. We've seen that scenario play out over and over again in any time that they have civil conflict. I think the worst outcome, the worst potential for violence would be, as Greg mentioned, a close race, a contested race, a Bush versus Gore situation. If there's a decisive victory, either way, for Trump or Biden, that is the best case scenario that we could possibly have. But because Trump, thus far, if you believe the polling, is behind, what you're going to see is a lot of the violence has actually been instigated at this instance from his supporters. The incumbent president himself has incited violence on the debate stage, which is extremely unprecedented. So if we're going to be seeing violence, it will be likely as a response to, as an instigation from some of the far-right militias, for example, Trump-supporting street gangs, and the like, in response to mass protest movements if they occur from the left.
Peter Dixon, what do you make of that? Do you think that's more likely to create violence?
Yes, I think sometimes by just talking it up, it can actually...
But Lydia's saying that it's more likely that Trump supporters would actually come out and create that.
No, I wouldn't agree with that.
Why?
I think both sides have got the potential, if the talking up occurs, to do the same.
Have you heard Biden talking up violence?
Not necessarily by Biden or Trump necessarily talking up the violence, but by, I think, watching the different factions stirring up their own trouble.
OK, Damien.
You know, I mean, here's the nightmare scenario that I think about, is the election drags on for several days in Pennsylvania, and it's the state that's going to define who wins or loses. There's a handful of poll workers working in some place counting the votes, and President Trump calls out his people and says, go to that place. We need to make sure that our votes are counted. And then you actually have unrest at a single location where the votes are being counted in a way that completely challenges the election and makes it almost impossible to even know who won or lost. That's the nightmare scenario that I worry about. There are many other ones that are possible as well. But I also think that there's a scenario that's possible where it could actually work out okay, that maybe there is a landslide victory. Maybe the results, if they're resolved in a day or two, I think Americans can be patient. If it drags on to a week or two and there's all court cases and there's a clear location where people are gathering, then I think it gets very dangerous. And I think that both sides have the potential to be violent. However, the difference is you have a president who's actually been encouraging violence on the part of his supporters, and you don't have that on the other side.
Salvatore's right, isn't he?
Oh, no. Look, I have friends in 2016 who live in university towns, and in 2016 they were organizing neighborhood self-defense units because they were convinced that the Trump brown shirts were going to come marching through their towns any day now. And, of course, those marches never came. Look, I think the United States, for all of its violence that looks terrible on TV, is a much more peaceful place than people give it credit for. There will be isolated incidents somewhere in the country of 300 million people. I certainly feel bad for the people who are caught up in those isolated incidents on both sides. But there's not going to be a civil war in America, whichever way this election goes.
Kim Hoggard?
I would just add to Greg's comment and to remind him that the president won election in 2016. The day following his inauguration, we saw 1 million women march peacefully in Washington, D.C. in response to his election. I think we've seen this year an incredible amount of inflammatory commentary from the president, which resulted in a kidnapping plot against the governor of Michigan. And we could cite a number of other examples, but I don't think it's a given, and I agree completely with Lydia that we do have to be careful about how we just discuss and make assumptions about what can happen. I do think that Americans are exhausted and they want to see a peaceful outcome. But just in these few days leading up to the election, it's become so heated with actual acts of aggression, whether it's with trucks blocking bridges or trying to run cars off the road. It's all we need.
Yeah, or rioting and looting in Philadelphia.
All we need is the president just to say something calming, and we can get past this moment.
Is he capable of that? Is Trump capable of that?
Sorry?
Is Trump capable of saying something calming?
Only
well, he hasn't shown himself to do it yet.
I mean, if he thinks it's in his self-interest to be calming, then maybe that's the case. But as he's proven for 4 years, President Trump's main interest is his own survival in politics. And so this election will be defined by what he sees is best for his campaign.
All right, let's bring in our next question. It's from Stephanie Zuniga-Ma, who's in our studio audience. You're a dual citizen. I think you've already voted, is that right?
I have. I sent in my ballot via email to Washington, D.C., where I vote.
And so just tell me about that. You bought a printer
Yes.
to do this. So you did a sort of do-it-yourself at-home vote.
Yes. In fact, I didn't want my husband to know that we bought the printer specifically for me to vote, but I guess the cat's out of the bag now. Yeah, so in D.C., they email you your ballot, you print it out, fill it out, sign it, and then scan it back.
And do you have to prove who you are?
They do a signature match. I don't know all the ins and outs of how it works.
Okay. What's your question for the panel?
Yeah. So, hi. As an African-American living in Sydney, I'm heartbroken watching the despair and division that's happening in America right now. For most of the 20th century, America has been a beacon of democracy. However, we now have a president that seems to encourage foreign actors to influence elections, attempts to disenfranchise large groups of voters, won't commit to the peaceful transfer of power, and refuses to condemn hate groups like the Proud Boys. In short, he is showing all the hallmarks of a dictator in training. If this happened in a developing country, Australia would speak out and denounce the country's leader and possibly even send in election watchers. However, Australian leaders have been silent. My question is, why isn't Australia doing more to hold the current administration into account?
Damien Cave.
I think that's a really good question in terms of accountability. I think that a lot of Australians, the ones I talk to, and I'm sure many of the people here, are simply awestruck, as are many Americans, at the state of the democracy. And I think it actually precedes Donald Trump. I mean, what you have is a system that really hasn't been updated in 60 or 70 years, the last time the electoral democracy of America was changed. It's kind of like an old house. It's got good bones, but there are a lot of things that are broken and need to be renovated. And so, why a country like Australia isn't speaking out? I think democracies hesitate to speak about their allies. They hesitate to tell other countries what to do, especially if it's their main security ally in this case. But I think that you're right, that there is room for more conversation about American democracy. And I think, frankly, it goes beyond the candidates. I think it goes to how do we as democracies, and this includes Australia, make democracy work again. For a long time, it hasn't been working for a lot of people. And there's been distrust growing across many, many democracies. And I think it goes beyond the people who are running. And so as voters and as countries and as people who care about democracy, what can we do to make sure that it puts its best foot forward?
You recently interviewed our Prime Minister about the relationship with the United States. What impression did you come away with?
Interesting question. So I did. I interviewed Morrison with Maureen Dowd, who was visiting. This was, I guess, last year. And it was quite clear that he was really interested in being quite cozy with Donald Trump. He wanted to get a message to him about their affinity for various things. I felt that he needed to, he understood that Donald Trump cares about personalities in transactional relationships. And so on one hand, you could say that Morrison was being very savvy in trying to protect that relationship because he knew that that was how Trump worked. By the same token, I came away surprised at, frankly, just how much that "can I get along with him in the pub" had sort of defined Australian diplomacy with the United States.
Stephanie, you said that you feel heartbroken. Why?
Well, I think that there's a lot going on in America that it's a broken country. My mother still lives in Washington, D.C., and I spoke to her yesterday and she was buying food to stock up just in case there are riots. I mean, this isn't the America that I guess I grew up with and that we've kind of come to know over the last 50, 60 years. It's not a welcoming, happy place. I think someone referred to it as being very cordial and friendly. It's not that anymore, and I think that's really hard to watch, especially from here.
OK, I want to reintroduce someone that we met last time we did a show on the United States, Eleanor Wells, who's in the audience. You told us last time how anxious you were feeling about this election. On election eve, how are you feeling?
I'm almost sorry I joined the show tonight. I'm already can feel myself getting really beyond anxious. I'm very unsettled about the whole thing. I echo everything that Stephanie said about the way she described the country. It's really frightening. And
so when you hear Salvatore say it's actually much nicer, much friendlier than we see on the TV screens,
I don't even know what he's talking about. I don't feel that. That's not to say that's not his experience. I would never describe it that way in any, not even close.
Salvatore?
I don't feel it.
Well, I did watch the show you were on last time, and while I respect the sincerity of your feelings, you talked about the potential for a new rise of fascism in America, Trump as the new Hitler. And whenever I hear that kind of rhetoric, I just, forgive me, I tend to roll my eyes at the ahistorical nature of it. I mean, when Mussolini in Italy seized power, the first thing he did was stage a march on Rome. And he wrote a book called The Doctrine of Fascism, laying out his plan. When Hitler took power, well, in 1923, he staged a coup. He was unsuccessful. He went to jail. He wrote a book called Mein Kampf, laying out his agenda.
Well,
None of that is happening in America, right? We have people who disagree with each other.
Let's just respectfully hear from Ella.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I didn't compare him to Hitler. I didn't think he was smart enough. What I said is he laying a template for a smarter autocrat. But to your point, I'm not the first person, even if I had compared him to Hitler. You've seen there have been dozens of articles and pundits talking about that. So we're not making that up. It's coming from somewhere. There's some bones to that argument.
Right.
But that's not my point tonight.
Yeah. Lydia, Khalil.
Yeah, Hamish, if I may, I wanted to add to this, maybe inject a note of optimism about what's happening in America. I mean, I share your concerns. Every time I look at an election headline, my heart jumps. I also have a bit of anxiety around this election. But I think to say that America is verging on dictatorship I'd have to agree with Salvatore in this one, in that we're not quite there yet. And this is coming from someone who was born in a country that is a dictatorship, Egypt, who has worked in the Middle East, where there are dictatorships, and you can see the difference in that. Despite all of the erosions to democracy that Trump has done, we have seen a really optimistic and I think energizing response. That's what I want to look to. You know, for example, we saw the Black Lives Matter movement occurring over the summer. Those were the largest protests in United States history. It showed the demonstration of America's soft power. It showed the leadership of the African American community to be able to push America toward its more perfect union and to its ideals. You know, Trump has eroded a lot of things, but we still have a robust and free press. We still have institutions fairly intact. So there are a lot of guardrails on American democracy that differ from other areas where you will see, a much more precipitous fall to conflict and to civil violence.
Kim, do you share that optimism?
I'd like to share that optimism, but if the president is to win a second term, we're going to have further assaults on the very institutions of government that are the pillars of our democracy. So there is room to be concerned here. The president has not taken on the mantle of being leader of all the country. He's taken on the mantle of being the leader of roughly 40% of the country. So if you're going to be the president of a government and you spend your entire time devaluing the government, devaluing your diplomats, the Justice Department, the FBI, I mean, what is there left to trust? We can't even trust the post office now. It's been politicized. And for somebody who presents himself as the anti-politician, the outsider coming in, he is the most political person I think we've seen in Washington since Richard Nixon, really. And that sort of, the disinformation and the distrust and the hatred that he does foment is very dangerous. And I'm not sure, I've never thought his presidency was sustainable because of the way he conducts himself in office. And certainly I think for the next 4 years, it'll be a real danger time for the United States, if it hasn't been already.
Greg, there is a danger to the way Trump is playing this game, isn't there? That's hard to deny.
So, Hamish, I find the way Trump speaks utterly despicable. And in 2016, I was a kind of a Bret Stephens, William Crystal, never Trump conservative, a modest conservative, never Trumper. But in his election, in his term in office, he's done some very good things and some very bad things. But I do think his critics do him an enormous favour by exaggerating the demonic quality of Trump. I couldn't have agreed more with a column in the New York Times by my favourite columnist the other day, Ross Douthat, who said Trump is not an authoritarian, he's an administratively incompetent populist. Authoritarians control the military, they control the judiciary, they disobey the courts when it rules against them. They are very popular, typically. None of that applies to Trump. The midterm congressional elections, the Democrats took control of the House. The Democrats have taken control of state legislatures. Trump has not disobeyed a court decision that has gone against him. And, you know, once I was on a panel in India with an Indian strategic analyst and a guy from the New York Times, and the guy from the New York Times was talking just the language we're talking tonight. Trump is the devil, it's a civil war of civilization against fascism, blah, blah, blah. The Indian, Raja Mohan, a great guy, said, look, as Indians, we have no interest in your American Civil War. We are interested in India's national interest, and we relate to the president you elect. And the president you've elected is very good from India's point of view. He calls out China properly, he calls out Pakistan properly, he's pursuing a close relationship with India. So you Americans go back and have your civil war. It's nothing to do with us. And I think for an Australian Prime Minister to respond in a broadly analogous way, while of course we're all, you know, consumed with American politics and everything, is perfectly sensible.
OK, let's take our next question. It's from Edward Schmidt.
Yeah. Okay, so I come from a progressive background and I'd still vote Democrat, but I feel like I'm getting pushed to sort of more conservative views by the left. Even here in Australia, if I say I'm not even a Trump supporter, but if I say something positive about him, I just get shamed and everyone gets angry and just goes away. So I can't imagine what an American person, a outspoken Trump supporter would feel. So my question is, if Trump wins again, will the left realize that they're pushing people towards Trump?
So I want an example. What sort of things have you said to your friends, and what's the reaction been?
I mean, for example, he did that speech in front of Mount Rushmore, and I just watched him, and it was a pretty good speech. But then all the headlines and everything are just like, it's a terrible speech, and it's on Native American ground, and it's just a bit ridiculous.
And what happens if you say positive Trump things to your friends?
Everybody just gets angry, and the whole dinner's ruined.
You've still got two friends here tonight.
Yeah.
Damien Cave.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think that there is a, what some people call a Trump derangement syndrome, where just the idea of Trump, some people have a really hard time processing. But, I'm not sure that the left is actually going to learn that they're pushing people to Trump so much as they're trying to fight, I think, within themselves. And especially, I mean, if Greg says if Trump wins by a few points or loses the popular vote but actually gets in, I think you're going to see the left get even more radical and even more unwilling to accept moderation in any way. So that's a concern, I think, for sure. But I do think that if Biden wins, you now have a Democratic Party that includes quite a lot of people who have moved from the right to vote for Biden. And the Democratic pool is much more diverse than it would have been before. And you'll have a candidate who won as a moderate. And so I actually think there's a real room for that kind of conversation to happen. Biden is someone who is more likely to try to bring people together. He's got the legacy of Obama, who tried very hard to do that too. So it is possible that there would be a renewal with the Biden victory, I think, as long as he can hold on to that middle, which is going to be very difficult for him.
And that's the key thing. It's not just the left that doesn't like the way Donald Trump is conducting himself in office. It is the moderate middle of America. And that's why you're seeing numbers like we're seeing in this turnout, in this election, historic turnout, because people have been motivated to vote. And we can certainly give President Trump credit for getting people in America who are typically apathetic when it comes to voting, unlike here in Australia, to go out to the polls. And hopefully, and this is where I can get on a hopeful note, like Lydia, that this is going to substantially change what Americans expect from their elections going forward.
Well, look,
they're going to expect to be able to get to a poll easily, to be able to vote early easily, to be able to maybe start tabulating votes.
Let's talk polling next question, but we all rightly criticize Donald Trump for his uncivil and unpresidential language. But let's take up what you're raising. I looked at the Twitter feed today for this program. There were more than 300 tweets in my feed, every single one of them, and I mean every single one, criticizing that man, Greg Sheridan, calling him all sorts of names, calling him, it's no wonder, Greg, that you're not on Twitter, because if you were on Twitter, you'd see what they're calling you. All the hatred poured out at Greg Sheridan, people saying Q&A is no longer balanced because Greg Sheridan is on it.
Well, let's be fair, though. Part of that criticism is because his boss is Rupert Murdoch. And let's be honest, Rupert Murdoch has had an enormous influence in American politics as well. So, there is a conversation that needs to be had, to your point, not just about is the left able to listen and change, but there are a whole system set in place that encourage extremism, whether it's in the media, whether it's in the electoral system, and these are the things that need to change.
300-0 anti-Greg Sheridan hate speech,
but you could
and he's opposed to Donald Trump.
You could say the same thing on the other side. There's definitely just as many, if not more, right-wing comments.
I'm talking about this program and the people who watch this program. Go back to your own feed. It's on both of our feeds.
Well, I understand that, and I don't agree with that kind of discourse at all on either side. But this is the problem. When you only just point out one side of the coin and not the other side of the coin, then we never get anywhere on this. This is happening, and this is happening because we have an unregulated internet situation. We have social media giants who are able to just run it the way they want.
And
governments
long live the unregulated
have
internet.
not gotten their head around how to handle this. And whether it's with television broadcasting back in the mid-'80s when the Fairness Doctrine was abolished, a regulation that required broadcasters to present balanced points of view, that opened the door to talkback radio shows in America because conservatives had a grievance that they thought the liberal media was biased against them and wasn't giving them a platform, and they wanted their own platform. Well, we've gone on to develop 24/7 news. We've got Fox News. We've got the internet, completely unregulated. And until we get a handle on that, this sort of discourse that provides a balanced point of view, like we're doing here,
I don't want
with
anyone
balanced
telling
points
the New
of
York
view,
Times
it's
what
not
they
going to
have
happen.
to publish and what they can't publish.
Yes.
And that goes as much for the New York Times as for every other outlet in the world owned by Rupert Murdoch or Jeff Bezos
As
or
long
anywhere
as
else.
they're presenting balanced points of view, not just one point of view.
Who says what's balanced?
Yes.
I don't trust you or Hamish or anyone else to tell me what's balanced.
Okay. This is a
Hamish,
good
can I
point.
go back to...
I just want to remind our audience that you can stream us on iView and join the conversation. As mentioned on socials, Quanda is the hashtag. We do always ask our panellists to keep it robust but respectful, and we do hope that you can as well. And so on this theme, our next question comes from Sneha Subramaniam in the studio.
Hi. So we're all aware of the questionable data and sources that have been quoted throughout this election campaign. I make particular reference to President Trump's interview, the Axios interview with Jonathan Swan, where they were analysing coronavirus data. My question to the panel is, how much do facts still matter? Do they still matter as much as they used to in the age of optics?
Lydia, Khalil, do facts matter?
Well, they have to matter. They have to matter because if we don't agree on shared facts, then we don't have a shared reality. And if we don't have a shared reality, then what are we doing? We will not be able to relate to each other as a human species. I mean, I think that's what makes us unique as humans, is that we are capable of having a shared reality and be able to build up our community in that way and to solve problems through that very basic construct. Otherwise, we're going to be living on different planets. I mean, just because people have differences of opinions and we're in a polarized media landscape and the information landscape is extremely fractured right now, to go so far as to say that facts don't matter, I think contributes to that problem.
But in this American election, we're talking about much more than differences of opinion. We're talking about the diminishing of truth. We're talking about the widespread pollution of information streams such that many voters cannot know what the truth actually is. That's a very different and unique thing, isn't it, Lydia?
Yeah, it absolutely is. I mean, you know, the internet does have a role to play in this, but I was actually just reading a study out of the Berkman Center at Harvard, and it was saying that while social media might be an amplifier, a lot of this disinformation, misinformation reality is coming from the mainstream media that actually gets amplified on the internet. I mean, the purpose of all of this disinformation is not a contestation of ideas. The purpose of it is to muddy the water so much that you just throw up your hands and say, oh, I don't know what reality is anymore. Who knows? You know, and accept that as our modern, you know, way of life. What I'm saying is that we cannot accept that. We have to put a value on empirical analysis, on empirical fact, you know, make an effort as a community to combat this.
And I would add to that you know, that is journalism. So the fourth pillar of democracies everywhere is a free and fair press. So we need to be investing in journalism, not cutting budgets, and we need to be expanding our media outlets that are you know, well-funded. Fortunately, here in Australia, you have a well-funded national broadcaster with the ABC. The United States doesn't have that. Their national broadcaster is a shadow of what we get here.
But hold on, earlier in this conversation, Salvatore was praising the free and open internet, right?
Yes.
Isn't that where so much of this misinformation, the lies, the hate...
Because it's where we find
lives?
our facts. It's where we pick and choose our facts. When you were on this show last time...
The algorithm
in
chooses
September,
your facts.
No, when you were on the
You're
show
often
last
not
time in
choosing them.
September, you told us that the U.S. economy had been destroyed during this coronavirus epidemic, and it was all due to Donald Trump. Yet, if you look at the OECD's September economic forecast, they expect the U.S. economy to do better this year than any other developed country in the world, including better than Australia. Now, those facts are both true. Which ones you report, right?
That's
a matter of judgment.
It's also the context.
Hamish.
You know, well, let me just answer that, because you've obviously studied the previous program quite closely.
I watched it. Of course I did.
But when I talked about a shattered economy, if you don't think that having 20 million people unemployed and having the deficit tripled to over $3 trillion, to have a debt of $22 trillion,
those are all facts.
to have Well,
but it's also a fact that the U.S. economy has outperformed
businesses
Australia,
closed.
outperformed Japan, outperformed every country in Western Europe.
Okay, but
Well,
what is
which
the
fact
reality
do we-
on the ground?
That's
What's
not a
the
fact.
reality on the ground in America for most people?
Well, the reality on the ground is not a fact. The reality on the ground is an interpretation.
With respect, let me just bring up an important fact. The coronavirus is real. It is killing
Absolutely.
people.
Yes.
And on the internet right now, particularly swirling around this US election, is a whole stack of information denying it. Isn't that a problem for democracy? Do you acknowledge that?
No, the problem for democracy would be if we didn't let people express their viewpoints. Because incorrect viewpoints are sorted out in the market for ideas.
Hundreds of millions of dollars out of the spread of this misinformation.
Yeah, it was an Australian doctor who discovered that stomach ulcers could be cured by antibiotics. That was radical misinformation being quashed by the medical profession until it turned out to be true. How do we know which opinions are true? We expose them to light. We discuss them.
I don't think it's so hard to find the truth.
Let me bring in Greg Sheridan, who's been trying to get in.
Yeah, so Hamish, first of all, let me congratulate the ABC on putting its social media reputation so much on the line by having me on this program. Very disappointed that Damien thinks it's a good thing that I'm attacked on social media because my boss is Rupert Murdoch. That's a strange New York Times view to have. But let me tell you, I'm very proud to work for Rupert Murdoch, and he's made a fantastic contribution to civilization. But I do think
I think that's a whole other discussion for a whole other program, Greg.
Yeah, well, look, you know, I mean, some prejudices, like the New York Times prejudices, are woke and politically correct and apparently sanctified. The rest of us just have opinions which are disgraceful because of who we work for. Not because of anything we've said, but because of who we work for. That is the New York Times in a capsule, and that's a big part of America's problem today. But I wanted to say this. I agree that we do need to regulate the social media. I do think we have a big problem with the incivility of discourse today, and the worst incivility, certainly it's encouraged by Donald Trump. Let there be no doubt about that. The worst incivility is found on social media. I don't do any social media. Apparently some people are so unoccupied that they do social media in my name, God bless them. But the regulation of the social media should not lead to political censorship. So if Dr. Mahathir says it's right that Muslims should kill millions of French people, that's right. I think the social media companies should stop his account and stop him from saying that. But if an American immigration official says we've stopped dangerous criminals from coming over the border with Mexico, that may be a bit of an unpleasant thing to say, but big tech and social media should not be able to censor that.
But Greg,
so what you've got to do, I think, is you've got to have clear regulations that incitement to violence is illegal, and I think the big tech companies need to be broken up. They are vastly bigger companies than anything Rupert Murdoch ever dreamed of, and they have too much power.
Greg Sheridan, though, should the tech giants silence, delete, remove, or somehow notify a tweet from the president which says coronavirus is going away or that it won't kill you?
No, I don't think they should. Look, the history of US presidents saying stupid things is very long and illustrious. And we believe in democracy, in freedom. We believe that you have a debate and you adjudicate on the rightness or wrongness of a person's arguments. Now, if the president, and he has never said this, but if the president were to say, I want you to go and take violent action against Hispanic people. So if the president would ever say, I want you to take violent action against people on the basis of their race, I think any social media company should delete that. But if they simply think that what he is saying is incorrect or tendentious or whatever, if he says the virus is going away, I mean, that is so contestable a proposition that it should not be censored. And here's the thing, you cannot allow only the speech that you find agreeable. You've got to allow people who say stupid things and even offensive things, provided they're not inciting violence or breaking the law, to be judged by the canons of debate. And it is a complete failure of faith in democracy to say Donald Trump is so convincing that all Americans will be misled by him and our only response is to silence him on social media.
Okay. Isn't that the role of...
But Hamish, what the president says... What the president says matters. What the president says matters. There's been studies that have said that he is the largest spreader of COVID misinformation online. And maybe some of the work that I do can shed a bit of light on this. I'm involved in an effort called the Global Network on Extremism and Technology, and where we're trying to tackle these issues with the major tech companies. And there are some belated moves, but I think important moves that are being made, particularly around COVID and the elections that are happening. There are disclaimers that are put when people say things that are contestable and harmful. If you're saying that COVID is not real, or that's a harmful thing. You know, if you're inciting followers to violence, that's incitement to violence, no matter if the president says it or others say it. So there has to be some limitations against an unchecked freedom of expression. We're talking here about things that are beyond expressing your opinions, beyond expressing your values. When you are inciting violence, when you are putting misinformation to such a large degree during a global pandemic, these are things above and beyond opinions.
Yes.
OK, I don't want anyone to think they're being silenced, but we're going to move on to our next question. If you've got more questions about this 2020 US election, ABC News actually would like to hear from you over the course of the next few days to help shape our coverage. You can submit your questions right now, as well as your thoughts if you want. The address is abc.net.au/US election. Our next question comes from Chris Pedersen.
Hi. My question regards Trump, unfortunately, as all others, is if he wins, what leverage as a nation does Australia have to ensure that our alliance and friendship with the United States remains intact in light of the pressure China's putting on us on trade and national security issues? Now, flip side to this is also, if Biden gets elected, how do we ensure that our friendship reaps rewards?
Kim Hoggard.
That's a perennial question that Australians have and Australian governments have. In my experience working in the Reagan and particularly in the Bush State Department, there's such a strongly cemented contract between Washington and Canberra. Our two nations like each other as people, by and large, up until this point, I think, in time anyway. And I do believe that Australia should remain confident that under whichever person wins re-election, that relationship will stay as strong as Australia wants it to stay. Having said that, though, I have to say that, you know, the problems that America faces after this election, whoever takes over, has enormous challenges at home. So their attention, and really the attention for much of this year, has not been on foreign affairs or foreign policy, dealing with existential threats like climate change. And certainly Australia is not at the top of the list of concerns that are facing government officials and policy analysts in Washington, D.C. So there has to be some realization around that. But I think Australia should be confident that America needs its allies, now more than ever, because of what it's going through internally. And Australia should be frank and forthright, as we say in the diplomatic terms, and feel comfortable to address their concerns about whatever foreign policy issues are driving them, whether it's the South China Sea, the trade relations with China. I think there's a lot of knowledge in Canberra and in this country within the electorate in general about important issues that are facing this country, and they're very articulate on. And I think there would be plenty of people in Washington prepared to listen to some advice.
Damien Cave, your fellow panellist, Greg Sheridan, wrote a piece tonight saying that, that China, Iran and the New York Times would love a Biden victory. What should Australia be hoping for here, a Trump or a Biden victory?
It's one of many assumptions that he appears to be making about the New York Times, but I'll let that one go. You know, I mean,
so you're saying the New York Times doesn't prefer a Biden victory? Did I get that wrong? I mean, just apart from your gratuitous insult, what are you saying I got wrong there?
I'm on the news side, Greg, so I try to play it pretty straight.
But you're saying the New York Times doesn't want a Biden victory, editorially?
The Times on the news, on the opinion pages, speaks for itself. And so there are people on that side. I don't deal with them. I don't talk to them about that stuff. I don't think that throwing the New York Times in with Iran and other dictatorships is fair. I don't think that, I mean, as you noted in your piece, Russia would also love to see Donald Trump win. We know Rupert Murdoch would also love to see Donald Trump win. Is it fair to throw those?
How do you know that?
I think it's pretty quite clear from just about everything Fox News has been publishing in the past week, in the past few months. I don't think Rupert Murdoch hides his views in these areas, but I don't think
well,
it's
you're
actually
making a false assumption
Greg,
that whatever Fox says is what
it's,
Rupert says.
I'm not.
That's a false assumption.
I don't think it's worth you and I arguing about our media companies. This is frankly one of the problems with how democracy works. Is it doesn't make sense for people who are trying to simply tell the story of democracies and try to help them actually work to be arguing with each other about our bosses. I don't think that's what anybody here needs to hear about. I don't think that's what the public...
Well, you started it.
Let's draw you back to the question, which was about the Australian relationship with America, whether we could rely on Joe Biden or Donald Trump, particularly in relation to China. John Bolton, Trump's former national security advisor, said that Trump is perfectly capable of doing a 180-degree turn on this sort of stuff.
Yeah, I mean,
this is a consequential election for Australia, isn't it?
It is, very much. I mean, I do think that Australia should be confident in that relationship. It goes much deeper than any individual president. If you speak to people in the American military, they have very close relationships that extend for decades with Australia and all kinds of parts of the world. And those bonds are not going to be broken very easily no matter what happens. That said, one of the things that's quite clear about how Trump runs foreign policy is it's unpredictable, and we know that. And so, if the United States feels threatened in some way or distracted by other things, then the relationship to allies can and will change. I think, frankly, we're in a moment, I believe, where democracies are really trying to figure out their place in the world, and that includes not just American democracy, but Europe. The whole system that was set up after World War II is in need of updating. Trump deserves credit for pointing that out, and I think recognizing that that's the case. What will form in its wake is still very much unanswered. And so I think Australia should also feel confident to play a larger role. I often tell Australians, don't forget, the size of your economy is the same as Russia's. And so not only is it a question of what can Americans do or how's that relationship going to work at the presidential level, Australians can also do more in the world.
Lydia, Trump is an anti-globalist, according to him, but very muscular on China in certain circumstances. Biden, clearly a more gentle operator, but clearly believes in the multilateral system. Which scenario does suit Australia better geopolitically in terms of our interests in this region?
Well, I'd agree with what some of the panelists have been saying. I think you'll find no matter who wins, you'll find an America that's more toward inward because we have a lot of domestic issues that need to be solving. In terms of China, there is a bipartisan consensus out of Washington now that extends beyond Republican and Democrat, that China is a rising threat and a strategic competitor to the United States that has to be dealt with forcefully. That's not going to change under a Biden or Trump administration. I think what you will find, though, is that with a Biden presidency, you will have a national security and foreign policy establishment around him. He's not going to have his son-in-law running his foreign policy. You will have seasoned advisors. You will have the State Department fill its positions again and function as a foreign policy-making body. Same thing with the National Security Council and Defense.
Is full of a whole host of people that believe in a version of America that I think many would observe just doesn't exist any longer. People like Nicholas Burns who have a view of America that I think many of America's allies would say is no longer there. Are they fit for purpose?
Look, I think that under a Biden presidency, you will see, more engagement in multilateral institutions, more engagement with allies, not taking allies for granted, understanding that relationships are not transactional. And, whatever goals of that presidency, whatever they have, they'll work toward putting it forward. And it's almost like, you will try to attempt to make your own reality. I think you have an America now that is understanding of its limitations in terms of how it is acting as a global leadership. It needs to, there's an understanding that it needs to repair its image in the world, particularly among democracies. And there's an understanding of a need to focus inward and to deal with America's domestic issues before going on adventures abroad. So there is that deeper understanding. But I think that, you know, you will, under a Biden presidency, at least have more of an engagement, you know, more attention paid to Latin America, a more robust and systematic type of foreign policy making that we saw under Trump that will be a lot more comfortable to allies across the board.
All right, on that note, let me take our next question. It's a video from Mohammed Masayadullah in Heidelberg West, Victoria.
During the current term of presidency by Donald Trump, we have seen that USA was able to avoid starting new war with any new country, which is different than from recent past presidents of USA. My question to the panel, can we credit Donald Trump for that? Thank you.
Salvatore Babones, he makes a fair point. Trump hasn't started any new wars.
Well, we certainly can't credit John Bolton, who we mentioned in our last question. I think it's really great that Trump got rid of him before we did go to war with Iran. Look, this has been a remarkably successful presidency on foreign policy. It's been done in an unconventional way. It's been a very messy approach to foreign policy.
What are the hallmarks of success then?
From a U.S. standpoint, because remember, Donald Trump's president of the United States. He's not president of Australia or Western Europe. From an American standpoint, security for Israel, a robust approach to Indo-Pacific security, increasing friendship with India. The U.S.-India relationship has grown by leaps and bounds. That's something that's threatened by a Biden-Harris administration. Kamala Harris, I think, would bring much more difficulty into the U.S.-India relationship. There, of course, have been no major conflicts. We've seen a reduction of U.S. Force presences in a lot of these conflict zones in the world. They're still there. I mean, American troops are still there, especially special forces, but we've seen a lot less impactful foreign policy in terms of the targeted killings under the Bush and Obama administrations, the invasions, the bombings. All that still happens, but it's happening at a much lower level, and I'm much relieved to see the United States, frankly, killing far fewer people out in the world than it ever has before.
Is that an overly generous appraisal, do you think?
I appreciate the questioner's question, but I would say it's a hollow accolade when he's basically starting a war within the United States. And I know that sounds a bit inflammatory, but just because he hasn't dropped a bomb or started a war somewhere else doesn't mean he's not a bomb thrower in terms of his politics. And I think that's a very dangerous thing. He's not only made the country more unstable, he's made the international community more unstable because of his unpredictability and because of his belligerence and his bromances with autocrats and thumbing the nose at strong alliances that we've had since World War II. When George H.W. Bush was president, and I was privileged to work in the State Department at that time, the first thing he did after the election was name his Secretary of State, James A. Baker, which by many accounts is considered the gold standard of Secretaries of State. And the first assignment he had was to get on a plane in February and go around to all of our NATO allies in Europe on a 15-day extravaganza, reminding them about their place in American interests and America's interest in Europe. We haven't seen this kind of leadership from Donald Trump, and it's been very disturbing.
The first thing Donald Trump did was take a call from Tsai Ing-wen, the democratically elected president of Taiwan, something no other U.S. president was willing to do.
Yes, and
he disrupted that cozy, very friendly,
and, you know, and
but very negative approach to foreign policy.
I would be happy to give credit where credit is due. If he didn't step all over it himself by taking credit for everything and dismissing every other president and every other administration's efforts, whether it has to do with the Iran nuclear deal, which he completely ignored the efforts and that went in to trying to secure some kind of certainty and reduce the ability
for one of the most evil regimes
However,
in the world.
He's left us that's a platform. Having worked in the State Department and having seen what treaties and the importance of international agreements are, no matter how flawed you may think they are, they're a platform to keep the conversation going, to keep the ability to adjust and to grow these relationships that's so important. I'd be happy to say, okay, he went and met with the North Korean regime. Even though every president, including Barack Obama, told him you'd be wasting your time, he gave away the one thing that the United States had in its pocket, which was not giving the regime legitimacy with a meeting with the president. But he chose to ignore that. And if he had gotten something out of it, fine, but he didn't. He stepped over the line, he got into the country, he got his photo up, and he had his bromance and love letters. But what have we got as a result?
3 years of peace.
Nothing.
I think, Hamish, I think we're missing the point here. The big change in international relations in the last 10 years is not Trump at all. The big change is Xi Jinping in China. Trump represents really, in many key matters, continuity with Obama, although he has produced 3 Arab-Israeli peace treaties, which would earn any other president the Nobel Peace Prize. But the big change in international dynamics is not Trump, it's Xi Jinping. When he became the boss of China in 2012, he changed forever the Chinese arc of political, geostrategic, cultural, social, military development. And any president has got to deal with that. Trump, in fact, leaves his successor, possibly Biden, tremendous leverage in a whole series of relationships. Trump is untutored in foreign matters, but he has a good, robust understanding of the crude nature of power. And the one thing more important than soft power is hard power. He's left leverage with the Chinese. The Chinese want the administration to take off the tariffs. He's left leverage with the Iranians. The Iranians want the Americans to relieve the sanctions. He's left leverage with the Mexicans. The Mexicans eventually had to cooperate with the Americans on illegal immigration. He's less leverage with the NATO nations who have been pressured into increasing their defence budgets. Now, in all of this, Trump has succeeded.
You're going to have to let some other people in. You're getting plenty of airtime.
I'm just suggesting that American foreign policy should be building itself. It should be building upon the achievements of previous administrations and presidents where it can. And it should not denigrate the efforts
with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain.
Oh, well, they weren't peace treaties.
Yes,
they weren't in conflict.
They don't address the elephant in the room, Greg.
I just want to bring Lydia Khalil in on this. As you mentioned, you were born in Egypt. Do you view these even as peace treaties?
No, they're an acknowledgement of realities on the ground that have been in place in terms of the relationship with Israel and its relationships with the Gulf nations for many years.
We've been looking for 30 years.
And it's a good step.
Yeah, but it's not a peace treaty. It's not a peace treaty because there was not in conflict.
They had conflict with Sudan.
All right, let's take our next question. It's from Ariane Ilkani in the studio.
Joe Biden confessed in the second presidential debate that he would, quote, move into renewable energy. Now, this would obviously mean a loss of many jobs, exacerbating the present jobs crisis. How do you think this statement and Joe Biden's overall climate rhetoric will affect voters in important states such as Pennsylvania, where according to a White House report released in October, more than 300,000 jobs are supported by the natural gas and oil industry?
You're 15, is that right?
15, correct.
Want to go into politics one day?
Yes, definitely.
I just want to check where you got the numbers, because there's a lot of contested numbers around the jobs involved in this.
Facts.
Yeah, so I want to check. Where did you get those numbers from?
It's according to a White House report released in October.
OK, cool. But you saw it on Fox, right?
Yeah, I did see it on Fox. I believe it was taken from there and also taken from a petroleum organization in America.
OK, Damien Cave.
I mean, it's definitely true that there are lots of jobs that could be affected, but it's also not clear that Joe Biden has said, one, that he would take these jobs away, obviously, or that he would actually do anything with fracking that wasn't on government land. And I do think that his argument is that there will be lots of other jobs created. I mean, I think sometimes of coal in Australia, which frankly has a lot of power in Australia, but doesn't actually provide that many jobs. Yep. And so there's no guarantee that renewables create fewer jobs than old forms of energy. What I think Joe Biden, to some degree, people outside of the Australian government, but within Australia, are trying to push for is a view of energy and a view of trying to figure out the best way to create that energy in a way that helps with climate change and that also provides jobs. They don't have to be mutually exclusive.
But Salvatore, this election could come down to Pennsylvania. couldn't it?
Yeah.
Will Biden have thrown it if he loses it?
No, look, the jobs narrative is, as everything, a complicated one. I doubt that any Democratic administration, including Joe Biden, would actually try to shut down the fossil fuel industry. I mean, remember, the United States has a federal gasoline tax, and in Australian terms, don't get ready to move, 7 cents per litre. 7 Australian cents per litre. That's 1/6 of Australia's gasoline tax, and it hasn't been updated since 1993. Right? So no president, Democratic or Republican, wants to make energy more expensive in the U.S. Now, what Joe Biden will do is, I think, throw a lot of subsidies at the renewable energies industry. That will generate lots of jobs. My concern is, will it generate productivity? Will it generate lasting jobs? Will it be good for the economy? Those are much tougher questions. Will it generate jobs in the immediate sense of people getting employed, even in Pennsylvania, making wind turbines? Absolutely, it'll generate jobs. That doesn't mean it's a good policy.
But was it a mistake? I mean, could it have cost him the election?
Look, who knows? We're not going to know about the election for another 3 weeks anyway in Pennsylvania. So,
but this is sort of to my point about the system. Is Pennsylvania shouldn't be the only place that's defining the election. You know, the American democratic system is so broken that the candidates can ignore huge swaths of the country in order to talk to a few 100,000 voters in Pennsylvania, because they're the only ones that get to decide.
But I mean, there's a few pathways that Trump has to victory through the Electoral College system, and most of them, if I'm right, include winning Pennsylvania.
And Pennsylvania is likely to be one of the most important states, along with Florida. But the thing is, there are a half dozen states in America that basically get all the attention. Because since the Electoral College was put in place in 1820, again, this was not something that was in the Constitution. It could be changed, but it has not been changed. And so what you have is a democratic system where a small proportion of American voters get all the attention at the expense of the rest of the country. What are the energy views of people in California? What are the energy views of people in Florida or in New York? You don't hear about them.
Look,
and that's a systemic problem with the democracy.
The United States is a federal republic. It is not a unitary democracy. And I embrace that. I think it's fantastic that we have competitive federalism
the country has
in the United States.
moved from there, Saul, and it's minority rule in a country that needs to move forward and
it's impossible to know that for certain Republicans simply don't go to vote in California. Why? Because of the Electoral College. Now, I'm not saying that that's a good or a bad thing. I'm saying it's worked for more than 200 years, and I think it's a sound and successful.
So that's the very reason it needs to be changed. If it's 200 years old, it needs an update.
Well, I'm a big fan of the U.S. Constitution.
And I would just say, on climate change or on renewables, well, how exciting. How exciting to think about that we can transition into something new. You know, the train has left the station on climate change. We can either be on it and start doing something about it, start creating new industries, develop research and development funding, go back to the golden triangle that the United States used to have, and Australia had to a certain extent, but it's stopped as well. And that is a partnership between government, between universities, and businesses, where government provided funding for research and development in the universities. The universities helped guide business on how to develop the things they were discovering. You know, we have the CSIRO here, which has been underfunded now. We're getting behind the train. We need to get on the train, and we need to be excited about the prospect, particularly for young people, of coming up with new ideas for how we can deal with this.
Well, the idea that U.S. technology is lagging in any way, I challenge any of you to get into the tech world and see a way that the U.S. system is not currently working. If there's one place where the U.S. is working,
the other thing is that if Biden is elected, climate will become a real big disagreement between America and Australia, just as it was between Obama and Abbott. The Chinese, of course, play the Americans off a break here. They are going at breakneck speed building coal-fired power stations, but Xi Jinping declares he's going to make China carbon neutral by 2060, and the American left liberal establishment swoons and says China is addressing climate change. But the Morrison government is not going to do any more than it's already committed to, and Biden will want it to do a lot more. So I think we'll have a lot more grief under a Biden administration than we would under a Trump administration.
Well, you'd have grief at the political leaders level. You have majorities in Australia and in the United States who see climate change as an existential threat and want their governments to do something.
Yeah, but they don't always vote the way you say in elections, Damien.
No, but it's quite clear that the polls show that this is a major issue for Americans, increasingly so, frankly, in a way that I even find as an American surprising. You know, in this election, you have, I think 58% of Americans are saying that climate change is a very important or a somewhat important issue for them. In the middle of everything that's going on, that's still what they're talking about.
Yeah.
So when at some point will the government actually reflect those values?
And they're seeing
That was
it
true
happening.
in 2016 too.
Let me bring in Lydia. Khalil, how big a problem would this be for the Morrison government if Biden wins, returns America to the Paris Agreement, commits to net zero by 2050? How does that reshape the dynamic between Washington and Canberra?
Well, it'll be a clear point of contention between the two countries. But I think what would be interesting to see with the Biden presidency is how much he's going to be toggled between the progressive elements of the Democratic Party, who are pushing for a Green New Deal, pushing for more robust action on climate change, versus more centrist elements who perhaps would not see such a rapid expansion of renewables, wouldn't go at it as hard. So I think that, Biden is going to be toggled back and forth, and certainly it'll emerge as a point of contention between Australia and the United States.
Okay, we're about to run out of time. I'm going to push you on all of this. I don't want anyone chickening out. Who's going to win, Salvatore?
I'm chickening out. Nobody knows who's going to win. We'll find out eventually.
Lydia, can you pick a winner?
I can't pick a winner, but I'm going to be taking a look at a couple of things. One is, will the white women who supported President Trump support him again? Will he get enough of the Latino vote in key states to support him in the same way? Will he siphon off a number of black men in in contested states as well in order to help him push over the edge? I think it's these micro indicators that we need to be taking a look at to see what's going to happen on Election Day.
Damien Cave, you were the Miami bureau chief for the New York Times. Which way is Florida going to go?
Florida is always impossible to gauge, but I will tell you the state that I'm looking at is actually Texas and Arizona, in two places where the surge of voters is beyond anything they've seen before. And I think it will be a real question as to whether or not this is the future of where the country's heading.
Greg Sheridan, I know you got burnt last time around, but give it another crack.
Well, Hamish, I'm sure you're not tempting me to make a fool of myself again. 4 years later, I went on the front page of The Australian and said, you can take this to the bank. Hillary Clinton has got this one. And the polls now are stronger for Biden than they were for Clinton 4 years ago. I think the chances are overwhelmingly in Biden's court, but there's a 5% or 10% chance or something that it all falls right for Trump. But it's like winning the lottery. He's going to sneak home if he does, but I think the odds are heavily for Biden.
Well, we'll put that in the bank, whatever that was. And Kim, your pick?
I think this year is the year for women to determine who the next president of the United States is going to be. I think they're coming out in droves. They came out in 2018 overwhelmingly. They not only voted in record numbers, they ran for office and they won elected office. They are the majority of the population in the United States, and I think they're going to bring it home for Biden.
Okay, that's all we've got time for. Please thank our wonderful panel, Kim Hoggard, Greg Sheridan, Damien Cave, Lydia Khalil, and also Salvatore Babones. Please put your hands together for all of them. Thanks for your wonderful questions. As always, next week, the return of the famous leather jacket. Maybe Malcolm Turnbull is here with an all-star lineup. See you then.